But is a silver lining in what's happening in this whole crazy Trump era upside down world that we are living in at the moment. And I want to tick off a couple of those, and then we can open it up for any discussion you would like to have. But the first point is that he's discredited enormously the imperial presidency. And I think that is a wonderful thing, because partly the reason why our foreign policy has been so interventionist, has been so destructive, been so costly, has been such a big failure, is that an unelected group around the presidency in what we now call the deep state, the National Security Council, all of the 17 different intelligence agencies deep in the bowels of the State Department and the National Endowment for Democracy, to say nothing of the Pentagon, and the military-industrial complex, and all the NGOs and all the think tanks. I mean, there's literally dozens and dozens of think tanks who live one way or another off government money through the back door or foundation money that's in the business of promoting the empire, promoting the NeoCon view of the world, promoting our intervention everywhere from the Idlib province in Syria to we're still, in North Korea 68 years after the war shouldn't have started in 1950. So the point is that the imperial presidency is at the heart of that. I mean, as a lot of you know, and as we all write about in our different publications all the time, we haven't had a proper war declared since, Pearl Harbor. And the fact is that if presidents had to go to Congress to get funding for the war and get a declaration of war, half of these interventions that we've been involved in, I wouldn't say half, I'd say 98% of them, never would have happened. And we had a good example of that not too long ago, which kind of set up the mess that we're in with Russia and Putin today. So I want to digress a little bit and mention that, because in that particular case, the imperial presidency was occupied at that point by Barack Obama. He had put out this stupid red line which said, we don't really know what's going on in Syria, but if somebody uses chemical weapons, that's the red line, we're coming in, whether you had any proof that Assad did it or some of our so-called allies and free rebels did it, or the jihadists that the Saudis were supporting. It didn't matter. He drew the red line. The attack happened in Ghouta, I believe it was, in August 2013. And the next thing you knew, Obama was called on his red line, and he hesitated first when the British refused to join, and then secondly, he kind of decided to throw the ball to Congress, asked them for a resolution of support. It never happened, and that gave Putin a wonderful opportunity to step in and say, we can cool down this situation by convincing Assad to give up his chemical weapons, remove the cause for war, remove the cause for the red line, and hopefully bring some sanity back to the situation. Well, that's exactly what happened. And as a result, we had a more sensible policy for the moment, except the neocons and the whole military foreign policy establishment were outraged that they were on the verge of regime change in Syria, which they desperately wanted. That was on the list. We'd already had it by that point in time, obviously, in Iraq. We had it in Libya. Syria was next. And Putin deftly stepped in and removed the cause for a war. So 6 months later, the uprising begins on the streets of Kiev, the so-called Maidan uprising. And the next thing we know, all the neocon politicians from McCain and all the rest of them to the State Department and the local ambassador and the National Endowment for Democracy and operatives of the CIA posing as State Department personnel and so forth, were all over the place fomenting the coup, financing the coup, and recognizing immediately, within hours, a government that was formed out of a lot of nationalist Ukrainians and even some neo-Nazi elements that was as illegitimate as you can possibly imagine, but it was recognized, and that set off this whole demonization of Russia and Putin, because obviously they had to respond. And the reason they had to respond is it's on their doorstep. It's like if there was some kind of uprising that occurred, you know, on the border of Arizona or New Mexico. And particularly, I just want to mention the craziness that developed with regard to the so-called annexation of Crimea. Because that is what has triggered this whole range of sanctions and this whole rapidly escalating Cold War 2.0 between Russia and the United States. And you know, when you listen to the Washington Powells and policymakers and the NeoCons, it's as if, you know, Putin were some kind of latter-day Hitler on the move, taking territory. And here's the ironic part. There is nary a Ukrainian-speaking person in Crimea, because Crimea was never part of the Ukraine. Crimea was always Russian. It was purchased for good money in 1783 by Catherine the Great from the Turks, who were always bankrupt and always needing money. It became an integral part of the Mother Russia in the era of the Tsars. Their great fleet, Black Sea Fleet, was home-ported in Sevastopol, right on the peninsula. In fact, everybody here has probably read The Charge of the Light Brigade, the great Tennyson poem that occurred on Crimea when the invaders were coming. Well, who were the invaders? What was the English, the French, and the Turks, and who were the defenders? The Russians. That was the great patriotic moment in Russian history. So the point is, it never was part of Russia until 1954. The Soviet Union was in its midlife. The succession struggle happened after Stalin fortunately passed from this life. And Khrushchev won the struggle, as all of you remember, liquidated his enemies. And by the way, there's this great funny movie out now that you might want to look at, with making fun of the Russian succession at that time. I'll think of the name in a moment and pass it on to you. But anyway, as a reward for his allies who helped him liquidate his two opponents, Beria, who ran the KGB, and a second opponent, he awarded the Ukrainian comrades who had helped him by having the Presidium pass a decree moving Crimea from the Soviet Socialist Republic of Russia to the Soviet Socialist Republic of the Ukraine. So, you know, that's how it became part of the Ukraine. The Presidium ordered it, and so here we are 70 years later saying the essence of our foreign policy is to enforce the writ of the dead hand of the Soviet Presidium from 1954. Okay, so that just gives you some feel for how far this whole empire has gotten out of control. And it's all happened. All of this policy maneuvering has all happened because of the imperial presidency and too much power in the Oval Office. And for whatever you know, you may say about Trump's characteristics, and his character is bombastic and uncouth and unpleasant and so forth as he is making the imperial presidency look bad around the world. And frankly, I think that's a good thing, because next time we declare a war, maybe no one will come, because who wants to be part of that? And really, that's a little bit facetious, but it's actually true. People are now starting to think around the world about their own interests rather than being just, you know, robotic adherents to the Western Alliance or to NATO or whatever. Clearly, the Germans are going their own way. There's several countries in Eastern Europe, particularly Hungary, and now Italy and others. And this is all a good thing because we don't need an empire. We are not appointed to be the policeman of the world. We can't afford it. We're going bankrupt doing it. And everything we've tried has failed and has been a shambles anyway, you know, from one side of the Middle East to the other. So that's the first thing he's doing.